Oh, hello world. It's been a minute, but these are CS50's office hours. My name is David Malan, and I teach this course called CS50 here at Harvard University, which is our introduction to the intellectual enterprises of computer science and the art of programming. And we thought we'd give you a quick tour before we take some questions that were submitted by you all in advance. Over here on my right, actually, is an old steel sign that was made by CS50's own Ansel, who was one of my former undergraduate students and advisees, took CS50. I still remember back in the day, he sat always in the very first row of Sanders Theater and would occasionally raise his hand, was also an aspiring musician, but he was also a wonderful engineer, and he actually took a whole bunch of sheet metal over to our friends at MIT down the road, another university, and actually cut them in the shape of CS50. Now, we didn't quite know what we were gonna get out of it because he asked me at one point, like, how tall should the letters be? And I think I said something like, I don't know, 3 feet. Well, it turns out 3-foot steel letters are actually pretty big, and they've been sitting there for like 12 plus years right now, taking up quite a bit of space, but it's a nice way to greet folks as they come out of the elevator, as I just did. Now, here on my left and on my right, we have a whole bunch of photographs, and each of these was put together by CS50's own Alexis, curated by CS50's production team, and chosen to represent some of the various activities we do here every year. For instance, here are some of our students down the road at Changsho, one of our favorite Chinese restaurants, at which we invite about 50 students every Friday during the fall semester of CS50 to just get to know each other and chat with me and the course's teaching fellows and CAs. Here we have some parents and students at what was Family Weekend a couple years back, whereby the parents of freshmen and juniors are invited to come back to campus and experience some of their kids' own classes. Here we have a student at the CS50 Fair, which of course is the end of semester celebration of students' final projects, which even if you're taking CS50 online, you create as well, albeit without the in-person fair. And then here's CS50's own rubber duck, personified by one of our teaching fellows here, who's kindly waving hello and greeting everyone to this most recent fair. One of my favorite photos in recent memory is actually this one. You might remember CS50's own Carter, who was our former preceptor, who helped manage the course and its teaching staff. This is the two of us standing on top of Memorial Hall, which is the beautiful building in which Sanders Theater is, and our friends there let us sneak up to the roof and actually see what the world looks like from the top down. Now, over here on our left, we have a Zoom studio of sorts. So we don't use this so much for CS50's videos that you might find on YouTube post-produced. We actually do a lot of live sessions here. So if you're familiar with Zoom and other technologies, we'll very often do some live classes for either students at Harvard's Business School through an executive education program, for CS50X's audience when we might have some questions for folks, and anything really involving liveness, like the CS50 walkthroughs of CS50X Puzzle Day. Now, if I actually turn your attention over to our right here, we have some beautiful canvases that were painted or really digitized by one of our own CS50X alumni, a student in Indonesia who wonderfully brought some still photographs to life by redrawing them and bringing them to these old-timey frames. And then as we pass through this threshold here, you'll see curiously like an old school barber's pole, and that means that CS50's own Scully is in, or has been in, the building. She's actually an aspiring hairdresser herself and often gives haircuts to some of CS50's team members, especially over the summer. Well, why don't we come on in and we'll meet another preceptor who's currently with us, CS50's own Yuliia.
Hi, David.
Well, hello, Yuliia. So nice to see you here.
Good to see you too.
Yeah.
You were giving folks a little tour of the office?
Indeed, we were. And so we thought we'd end that tour with an actual Q&A session. And as you might know, Vlad and Max have kindly solicited a whole bunch of questions from you all about CS50, computer science, life more generally. And maybe we thought we'd kind of have a conversation about them and do our best to answer.
Yeah, sounds great. I have some questions over here, and maybe I will start with the one that probably on everyone's mind. So, with the rise of AI and vibe coding, do you think it's still worth learning how to code?
Was it asked in that tone?
Yes.
Oh, okay. It's a really good question, and I do think yes, insofar as like classes like CS50, and I think a lot of the programming assignments we do, we're never really about teaching you how to program in C or Python, because honestly, at the end of the day, and certainly years from now, who really cares about that particular language? It's really about the ideas, the methodology, I think the logic that you derive from studying and having to learn how to program that just tends to serve people well. I'd like to think that it helps make your thinking more clean, more methodical, more algorithmic, as we say in CS50. And as it relates to AI, I think where the real opportunity at hand is that AI is already, and probably soon ever more so, will just make you and me and anyone who has a bit of programming background just all the more impactful, and it will amplify, so to speak, their work, so that instead of implementing 2 features, they can implement 3. Instead of solving 3 bugs, they can solve 4, or even exponentially more than that. So I think it's actually an exciting time, because it's going to get rid of a lot of the minutia and the mundaneness of a lot of programming historically.
Yeah, so thinking about it more as a tool and a partner rather than a replacement for humans.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
even software engineers.
I mean, GitHub kind of put a stake in the ground and claimed this term as a brand name, but like I think Copilot is the right mental model, because you still are, as the human in charge, you're the pilot of sorts. And so if you think of the AI as being a co-pilot that really does as you ask it, then it makes perfect sense that it should stand to improve your own productivity.
Yeah, so what do you think about tools like Copilot or like Cursor as it relates to students who are just learning how to program or learning computer science?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not great to rely on those crutches too much too early. And I say this having grown up in like the calculator era, whereby back in the day, it was just sort of made intuitive sense that, all right, well, if you solve every problem on your homework or in class using the calculator, then like, what's the point of any of it if you're just asking the computer to do it? And so there was something to be said, even when we were in like middle school, for developing the muscle memory and the mental model for how to do arithmetic, multiplication, whatever. And then once you're comfortable with that, to the point where it just gets boring to keep doing more of that, to then graduate to using the calculator. And I felt this way even in college too, taking higher level algebra and multivariate calculus classes, that I found it useful to use the calculator, frankly, to check my answers. Like, we didn't have ChatGPT in the day, but we had a calculator, so you could very deterministically answer the problem, but it would have been stupid to just ask the calculator to do it for you. Otherwise, what's the whole point of the exercise? So I think that's still pretty true with AI.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, like, speaking of AI, maybe together with CS50 now, like, how is this symbiosis going? Like, what's next with AI being more prevalent, like, every day?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, we've really steered into it in the sense that we have this CS50 rubber duck debugger that we have brought to life virtually. So instead of just being this inanimate rubber duck on a student's desk, or this virtual chatbot that literally just quacks back at students, it now speaks English or Ukrainian or any number of other languages, to the extent it's been trained for those languages. And I think it's been pretty game-changing overnight. It's like having a pretty good virtual TA, teaching assistant, by your side.
24/7, patient,
yeah, and it's only going to get better and better, much like a human TA would only get better and better over time with practice.
Yeah, definitely. And we've seen it being very helpful with students, both on campus and online, especially for, students who are maybe at Harvard or at Yale. Like, a lot of them do homework at 1 a.m. No TFs to answer questions at 1 a.m., but having CS50 AI has definitely been very helpful for them. Well,
and I think especially in a traditional campus environment where you really do have strict deadlines, you've got a lot going on, unlike taking an online class like CS50X, which is and can be self-paced. So it's okay if you kind of have to put it down and wait an hour, wait a day, wait a week to sort of figure out some problem or get some help, because you're not bumping up against a deadline that's midnight that night or midnight the next day. And so I think having that availability just makes wonderful practical sense on campus.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe let's pivot a little bit from AI.
Okay.
And maybe we'll come back to it later. But let me see what interesting questions we have here. If you were to begin computer science in 2025, what would you do differently or the same, and why? It's a very interesting question.
So it's currently 2025 for those of you watching this online. I don't think it's all that different, at least when it comes to introductory material and fundamentals. Like, to your question earlier about the effects of AI, well, I do think you don't want to overly rely on it early on, but I think you still probably want to learn a lot of the same material, at least when it comes to foundational courses. So I would caution that taking a class that just teaches C or just teaches Python or just teaches JavaScript is okay if your goal is to learn that particular language for some job or some other application. But I think CS50, at least in a lot of introductory courses like it, are really about the ideas and the underlying algorithms and data structures and methodologies for solving problems. And I don't think any of that has changed or should change, because it's really just teaching you how to think and how to solve problems. I think what would change likely is maybe, ironically, certain higher level classes, or at least classes that were always a little less academic and a little more professionally oriented. And I think always of an example of like when I I didn't even teach myself, when I let a online course from Stanford University teach me iOS programming for the iPhone years ago. It was a wonderful course, so well taught, so well produced, but I really just wanted the skills. There wasn't, at the time at least, a lot of juicy academic or intellectual ideas, and that was fine. Like, I got what I signed up for, and they were simply teaching what the technology could do. And in fact, ironically, once I and a buddy of mine started teaching for Harvard's Extension School, the continuing ed program, our own iOS class, arguably that class got less and less interesting as the years passed, because Apple, the authors of the programming environment, were making it so much more user-friendly and automating certain things like memory management, getting rid of the equivalent of pointers, essentially. And so there was just much less meat on the bone, ultimately. And so that's the kind of thing where I think AI would have served us well, because I could just ask it, how do I make the user interface look like this? Or like, how do I call a function when a user clicks this button? Stuff that was never that interesting. And it's just more efficient to have a smart or artificially smart entity tell you how to do it.
Yeah, and so I guess for things like that you just call like bit more like mundane, maybe like even like syntax, right? Learning that can be a little bit tedious. Do you think it's still like valuable for intro students who are just learning how to program to still sort of like develop the muscle memory and learn the syntax and in and outs of like C or Python just to get used to it?
Yeah, for the first language or two, because so many students take like CS50, for instance, coming from other fields, from the arts, humanities, sciences, social sciences, and they just don't have that experience yet of dealing with stupid stuff, like why does the computer require the semicolon or the parenthesis there? But I think you do want that and benefit from that being ingrained. And you really understand then that these computers and the languages they speak have a grammar to them. There's a very precise syntax. And much like we spend some of our childhood learning not just to speak, but how to write English or some other language, there's some value, I think, in learning the rules. But when it comes to your third or fourth language, something like that, then it gets much less interesting, because you already know the ideas. You just need someone to quickly translate it to you, much like you might want a human translator or Google Translate helping you with a conversation.
Yeah, definitely. What are some other questions we have here? Someone asked how to code cleaner and build logic, and maybe how to like translate your ideas into code.
That was a big question. The simplest answer is to say, like, take some class that teaches those principles, or don't just read about them in a book, or don't just take some online tutorial, but rather apply them.
Just get practice,
Yeah, and either using some automated system, like CS50 has Check 50, which gives you automated feedback, and Design 50 now, and Style 50. Or if you've got a friend, a family member, a colleague who can sort of critique your code, that's super useful. In the real world, even though AI is starting to move in on this space too, like having humans do what are called code reviews, where a human gives you line by line or file by file feedback on the quality of your code, super useful, especially when you're learning until the tables turn and then you can be providing that advice, is super useful. But I think some kind of iteration where the goal is not just correctness, but to improve as the student asks.
For sure. And maybe for folks who are just tuning in and maybe just learning about CS50 and what it is, would you want to talk a little bit like how it started and where it is now and maybe where it's going?
Oh my goodness. Okay, also a big question.
Just a little preview of the history.
CS50 started in 1989, a few years after Harvard University introduced computer science itself as a major or concentration at the university. Previously, anyone who wanted to study computer science or computers more generally, no need for air quotes there, computers more generally, was to study applied mathematics, which still exists, but is less encompassing now of computing. I myself took the class in 1996. I then took over the class as the teacher in 2007. We've made a lot of changes over those decades, including during my time, like changing some of the languages that we use, changing a lot of the assignments that we tackle, changing a lot of the cultural and community traditions, like the lunches I alluded to earlier and the fair that I mentioned earlier, something like the CS50 hackathon. And so I think it's really evolved year over year. And in fact, we're surrounded by even more photos that tell the story over time. I think AI is definitely one of the biggest changes to the student's experience. I do hope for the better in the form of the CS50 Duck. I think that what you'll see from CS50's team in the time to come is more and additional content moving in different directions, as well as updates and refreshes of some of our past, now older content as well. But stay tuned for a case-by-case announcement on each such endeavor.
Awesome. And maybe as we're in the period of history, I'll talk a little bit more about myself.
Yeah,
and,
please.
When you were saying when you took CS50, I wanted to say when I took CS50. So I also took CS50 in 2020.
Oh my God.
Which is much more recent. But I was a student at Yale. I was a sophomore, and I was majoring in stats, statistics, and data science. And one of her requirements was intro to programming. And unfortunately, I think I took CS50 during the worst time. It was the fall of COVID, where everything was very virtual, but it was still my favorite class. And clearly because I'm here. But it was definitely a very meaningful experience. And I later on went to do more data science courses that were definitely maybe not completely C focused, more Python, but having CS50 as an introduction gave me a really good foundation for how to think about languages and how to even then build it on for maybe data science coursework. So anyone who's watching and maybe doesn't want to be a software engineer per se, but data science, data analytics is something that you want to pursue, definitely gives a very strong foundation.
And did you end up taking other computer science courses or really just focusing on stats and data?
Yeah, so after CS50, I took data structures and algorithms, which is like a typical second step in the CS sequence, and that was unfortunately in C, which was a little tedious, but it definitely gave me appreciation, even a deeper one, of how computers work and what's actually going on in the background. I never had to use C since, except for teaching it in CS50, but it definitely gave me, again, this like deeper understanding of like how data structures work. And I didn't end up becoming a software engineer in that sense, but after that I took some machine learning courses, which were again more like Python focused, and some like data science application courses, which again go towards the direction of like Python or R. Yeah.
And now you don't do that much programming with CS50, but you live in this computer science world. Did you mind helping folks appreciate what is it you like, therefore, about CS if you're not practicing it in the coding sense that so many people do?
Yeah, definitely. I think I've always been a numbers and a structures person, so I really appreciate that approach to things. And I think
she really likes spreadsheets.
I do really like my spreadsheets. And well, you say it, I don't code, but I do. I think I write like R scripts for like little things that I need to automate, or even dealing with Google Sheets and all the formulas that help me like just compress all of the things much quicker. There's still like an algorithmical steps to it, and you need to know how to nest these formulas properly. But I think what I used to appreciate about like math and then CS was this like very deterministic approach, like you sort of like know the correct result. But I think with AI and then just like how computer science is evolving, I think there are more and more possibilities to how things can be interpreted or like what products you can make out of them. So I think I just started to grow appreciation for like diversity of the field as well.
Interesting. It's funny you mentioned spreadsheets, because just the other day I found myself using ChatGPT to ask it how to come up with a formula to solve some problem. And it was so wonderfully useful, and it actually got it right. And then I'm like, oh, of course this is how you do it. But I couldn't have cared less about like what the function is called or what the syntax is. Like, it's completely intellectually uninteresting. But I also didn't want to slog through even the documentation and Google around and figure out how do I do this piece and this piece. I just want the answer so that the next time I want to do this, like, okay, now I know what I'm doing. And so that was like actually a perfect use of AI, because I still understood the basic building blocks, like testing for equality, testing for the empty string, anding those conditions together. I just didn't know the syntax to use, and ChatGPT did.
Yeah, I use ChatGPT maybe way too often, especially when I'm dealing with spreadsheets, because I know the idea of the formulas. Like, I very often even say, like, I think I should use this formula, or like, this is probably how I want to patch it in together. But again, these syntactical errors, it's like, oh, this function takes one argument instead of two, and I'm trying to plug in two values into it. ChatGPT does pick up on it pretty quickly, and then it moves like so much quicker. And I think by talking to other people too, like, it does really become like a productivity tool, and that's how I'm hoping it continues to be moving in that direction, rather than, you know, like replacing people completely.
And it, you know, it's funny, the form that ChatGPT has taken is like this chatbot, even though you can use voice nowadays too, because how I learned PHP back in the day, which eventually we introduced to CS50, and how I then learned Python was pretty much by like DMing or texting a couple of smart friends of mine. Annoyingly so, constantly asking them questions, because when it comes to programming languages, it's often, or has been historically, kind of hard to Google certain things like syntax, because syntax is usually weird characters and search engines might typically ignore that, although I do think in recent years Google's gotten better at that. And so now it's just me not asking the same questions, using the same kind of technology, but I'm not bothering my human friends anymore.
Object.
And I only occasionally now escalate to those humans. Brian is one of my go-to humans who teaches some of CS50's courses.
Well, he'll clearly never be replaced by AI.
No, he did win that award recently. But there's a line where like you're probably asking the humans too many questions and overstaying your welcome. And so I think relying on AI and then only escalating to the humans is kind of a good approach.
Yeah, and I think we also took that with our on-campus teaching fellows with CS50 AI. I think the whole idea is to remove these stupid questions, some technical errors or some very common questions to AI, and then using teaching fellows for design questions, right? How I can improve my code, having these discussions versus them having to spend time explaining these small details that we can now delegate to AI.
Yeah, because if you're learning some language for the first time or taking CS50 for the first time and struggling with syntax and you just didn't realize the parenthesis has to be there, or again the semicolon or the like those were never interesting problems, and they can be so frustrating to bang your head against the wall, so to speak, not being able to see some bug or solve some problem. And I think that's discouraging to a lot of people. It's certainly a time sink for a lot of people. And after a few seconds of that, a few minutes of that, I dare say it's always been diminishing returns intellectually, because it's not like you're getting better and better by just spending more and more time not solving the problem. So I think being able to unstick people in this way more readily is super powerful.
Eliminate those little hurdles, definitely. Yeah. How about we go back to some questions that we have over here?
Okay.
And a lot of people are asking about other, not the core CS50 course, but the web course, the games course. I know you alluded to it a little earlier, but do you want to share a little bit more about the future plans and what a new content we're hoping to release?
Yeah, some in the works. So we do want to release a new and improved version of the games class, both focused on 2-dimensional gaming and as well as 3-dimensional gaming. So stay tuned on that front. Certainly want to introduce all the more AI content, which we do have already in the form of Brian Yu's course on programming with Python and artificial intelligence. But that course, of course, assumes a programming background. But there's just a lot of juicy ideas around AI that we introduce a little bit into CS50 using material that Brian himself actually developed a few years back, but really just scratching the surface. So we hope to have now a introductory course in artificial intelligence that does not assume a programming background, so stay tuned more there. The course on business and technology in compute and the intersection with computing itself has drifted out of date, and you can probably go back and see that even some of the numbers are now outdated, like how many megabytes or gigabytes people tend to talk about. So plan is to update that, especially for folks who don't really want to or need to learn how to program, but do want to have more of a vocabulary in technology and be more conversant and can hold their own, understanding at least how all this stuff works. So that's on the horizon. And we hope to a new version of a programming class using not JavaScript, using not JavaScript, but Java, which is a class we've not yet introduced in CS50, but we do, of course, use JavaScript a little bit in CS50 itself, as well as the web class with Brian. You mentioned R too, and for those unfamiliar, it's literally a programming language called R. Carter, whom you met on the roof of Memorial Hall a little bit ago in the photo, teaches a course on exactly that. So if you're curious to do more of Yuliia's world, where you can use it for data and number crunching and the like, check out Carter's course already on that.
Yeah, definitely very helpful. And I think you knocked off a lot of questions with your answer, but some people are wondering if there is any hopes to go beyond the intro part and maybe do a course on data structures and algorithms, which I also mentioned earlier.
Yeah, we should. That's a good one. It's definitely an FAQ. We don't currently have plans for such, but it is of genuine interest. In the meantime, my go-to answer is always to recommend our friend Kevin Wayne at Princeton University, who on Coursera has a course about algorithms. So if you go to coursera.org, search for algorithms Princeton, should pop up. That's a really good class, and he's a really good professor. So in the meantime, let's refer you to our friends over at Princeton.
Awesome. So I think that really answers a lot of questions that people had about next, what's next, and what about the other content that we're developing. Here's a really funny question. If a person learns binary code perfectly, does it mean that they can reverse engineer anything?
Sort of, in the sense that at least you know what you're looking at, like those zeros and ones actually translate to something. but you have to know what to translate them to still. So you need to have like the equivalent of an instruction manual for the CPU, the brain that is meant to read and interpret those zeros and ones, because they could very simply be numbers. They could instead be letters. They could be representing colors. They could be representing images or videos or audio or any number of other things. And you need to know what conventions are being followed, because you need to know, are you treating the zeros and ones in units of 8, aka a byte, units of 16, 24, 32, 64, something more.
There are a lot more details going on than just the binary itself.
Yeah, and at least if you have the so-called instruction manual for the instruction set of the CPU, the central processing unit, you can at least then know by convention whether you're looking at a pattern of zeros and ones that does represent a number, or if it represents an instruction very low level, like addition, subtraction, loading from memory, storing in memory, some basic building blocks. But you need to have that sort of Rosetta Stone of binary to help you know what you're looking at.
Because otherwise it's, again, just ones and zeros.
Yeah, and they might as well be random if you don't know how they are laid out.
Yeah, definitely. And some folks are wondering sort of if you have any career guidance or advice for people who are pursuing bachelor's in computer application or computer science and want to pursue coding as career. Again, probably a little broader of a question, but...
I think it's probably as or more important than ever to just make sure you stay current, because it's all too easy, ever more so nowadays with things changing so darn fast, for your skills to sort of drift out of date, so to speak. And that might just mean you're really good at your job and really good at the application or applications that your company or your university develops. But if you change roles, or if those projects go away, or if that job goes away, you want to be able to apply those same skills presumably to other domains as well. And so if you allow yourself to drift out of date and don't do some equivalent of continuing education, you're probably not setting yourself up as readily for long-term success. And you don't need to like go take more courses or pursue more degrees, but staying current, like, you know, learning other languages by just taking free courses or reading articles or staying abreast of tech news on websites like TechCrunch or even Reddit or the like, just so that you're generally aware of how things are evolving and you're not sort of fixated in time. I think that's all pretty good. And if you're already into programming, odds are you would like all of that homework anyway. So I think that's probably the best advice. And certainly when it comes to AI, make sure you've used GitHub Copilot or similar tools, so you know what people are talking about, you know what they're good at, you know what they're bad at, and you continually get a sense of like what more is out there.
What is your like a few favorite ways to stay updated on what's going on? I know you mentioned TechCrunch, Reddit.
Smart friends who am I paying once in a while. Yeah, honestly. So those are kind of my go-tos nowadays. And hacker news, if you go to news.ycombinator.com,
Probably.
it's a popular website for people to post this kind of stuff and upvote it and downvote it. So those three are pretty good sources overall, I would say.
Yeah. All right, let's see what else is here. Someone asked that they've been struggling to solve coding problems. What should they do to fix that?
Oh, let me take a look at this. So someone is struggling to solve coding problems. So what should they do?
Oh, I didn't know it was going to be an Uno reverse situation.
Yes, Uno.
I'll talk about what I sort of do to get myself unstuck. I'm a very visual person, so I like drawing things out, and there's definitely advice that I give students in section and during office hours, like grab a whiteboard or a piece of paper and try to visualize the problem that you're trying to solve. I think after that, if it's like a bug or something you're stuck on, like talking to a friend or a doc, or even using CS50 AI to just like get your words out there, I think is helpful. Like you think that you're having the right thoughts, but unless you like verbalize it or visualize it, I think it's harder to untwist them in your head. Yeah.
Spoiler, will CS50 ever include Java?
Oh, I think we just learned that it will.
So that's timely.
Yeah.
Why is CS50 such a long course?
That's a great question. I think we just... I don't know. I feel like you have an answer, and I don't want to say the wrong answer.
I think you should reject the premise of the question.
Well, I don't think it's it's a long course. Like, it might feel long just because there's a lot of information and it does feel like fire hose at times. Like, that's what we tell students in the very beginning. But it is like pretty systematic, and it gives you a taste of a lot of different things. And we, again, like spend like 5 weeks on C for a reason, not just like jumping right into Python, just to build that foundation, and then like having like sprinkles of like other languages so that you can get a taste of it and get a little bit of practice. I like CS50 for this like array of things, and you're not just like hyper focusing on Python or like C, that probably a lot of students would rebel against because no one uses C anymore. But having like a foundation and then the sprinkles of different things that students can then like go and learn themselves, like either take, you know, continuations of those particular languages with CS50, like CS50 SQL, CS50 Web, or even, you know, maybe that will get them excited about other like courses in colleges or some side projects they want to pursue.
Yeah. And I proposed rejecting the premise of the question, so to speak, simply because I don't think it's that long, and I think that probably depends on your familiarity with different sort of durations of courses. Like for us, CS50 it's supposed to be a 16-week course, but the realities of vacations and scheduling is such that it's really like 12-ish weeks, depending on how you kind of view the schedule.
I think it's a dense course, but it's not necessarily long.
I think we would do a better job if it were a bit longer, frankly. And I mean, if it were shorter, sure, we could do that. We could chop it up into 2 halves, but then it's just semantics.
Just 2 courses.
Then, so I'm not sure that really matters. I think I think it would be maybe a more, I don't know, instructive question would be like, does CS50 have too much material in it? And that could very well be the case, because we do try to do a lot, dare say too much in the time that we have, but I do mean it. If we had 2 additional weeks, I think we in CS50 can do a much better job at the tail end of the class with languages like JavaScript and the like that I do think are wonderfully germane nowadays and applicable, but we just barely have enough time to scratch the surface. And so that's, I think, where we fall short, especially in our traditional duration.
Yeah, and I think that's like where folks that taking course online on edX or at their own pace like do have an advantage to sort of like pause, type, rewind, like really taking the material at their own pace, which gives them a lot more flexibility that like even students on campus have.
Here's a question. Professor Malan, what key habits helped you develop such clarity in explaining complex concepts?
Speaking as Yuliia, not Professor Malan,
Okay.
I think just iteration of the times that I had to explain like concept or the problems to folks. I was actually seeing one of my close friends last weekend who I was taking CS50 with together, and again, it was the time during COVID. We were alone, sort of like in a dorm, like we couldn't go to office hours, we didn't even have other like classmates to talk to, so we did spend a lot of time just like talking to each other about like concepts and thinking about problem sets and like pseudocoding together. And after we finished the course, I was like, okay, if I can like explain a lot of the things to her like while I'm taking the course, maybe I could be a good teaching fellow and help like more students do that. And that's sort of like how my journey in CS50 began, but really just like approaching it from different directions. Like, is it like a visual learner or more like through sentences or comparisons? Like, I think trying different things, picking what makes sense to me, but also makes sense to the person that I'm talking to. And again, I think just practice, like what I've taught CS50 sections for like 6 semesters now. I definitely got really good at explaining CS50 material, but again, just having that foundation also helps me apply it to other parts of the world or life.
I agree, and this is similar in spirit, and this is the geeky way to describe it, but in designing software, it's common to have what are called user stories, where you come up with a persona or a type of person or a type of user and their needs, their use cases for your software, and you make sure, you decide for yourself, does our software meet the needs of that user? Tell that story. And even though I don't teach with that mindset, I think that's one way to reframe it, because I probably on some level think to myself of a fairly less technical family member or friend whom I want to explain something, and I use that same language more broadly that then might work for many other people as well. So that's one way to think about it, whether it's like your mom or your dad, your sibling, your colleague. Like, think of that person when you're trying to explain or teach something and see if that helps the words flow at the right level.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. How about, let's see. A lot of questions here that we already plucked off. Oh, here's one that's good for everyone and a good religious debate always. What's your favorite language to code in?
This is such a tough one. I think, to be very vanilla, it's probably Python, just because how easy it is. And it really does, as you get used to it, probably read more like English. So easier for beginners. It's definitely very broadly used language. So probably, again, I mean, for asking questions' sake, even like consider there's no ChatGPT. That's really helpful, but also just like very versatile in a lot of different things. Like even in data science, like using pandas library or like different graphs like have been very helpful. Or even when you try to build like an OpenAI like API like chatbot, like Python is very easy to use it in. So I'll be very basic in that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe to view it through a different lens, why is C not your favorite language?
It's a little tedious.
Okay.
There's definitely a lot. Well, because it's more low level, you have to be very careful with the way that you like program things. Like something like a great example from lecture, like implementing the speller problem set, like in C versus Python. Like Python, it's like a dozen lines, and like in C, it takes like multiple files and like memory allocation issues that you have to play around with. So I think for tedious reasons, I don't really mind syntax that much. I find it like oddly therapeutic that you have to follow certain rules and like have curly braces and semicolons, but I think even Python accomplishes a lot more in less lines than C does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
What about you? What's your favorite language?
I love them all equally, just like our final projects.
Right.
My answer to this for a while had been JavaScript, just because I think there's a lot of really interesting ideas within JavaScript. It's sort of this single-threaded model, and if you want to do things asynchronously, you kind of have to manage that, and the techniques for doing so have evolved over time from using what are called callbacks, which we kind of talk about in CS50, where if a function can't get you the answer right away, it calls you back by calling another function with the answer as an argument. And I always thought that was interesting, but long story short, using that paradigm tends to lead to atrocious nesting and nesting and nesting and nesting and nesting unless you define bunches of functions. Promises are a thing, which I hate at least the syntax for in JavaScript, and it really annoys me that it's hard to make an HTTP call in JavaScript.
So far, you're only mentioning negative things about JavaScript.
Oh, right. Well, yes. I think that maybe it's a love-hate relationship. I love the language, but I hate what they've done with it.
Right.
And I will say, that, at the risk of now insulting the entire JavaScript community, that the world changes so damn fast that like so many different libraries and trends and paradigms, which is great because like humanity is moving forward in some sense, but you feel like you're out of date 6 months, 12 months later, which is true in technology in general, but I think not quite at the same rate as within JavaScript. Now that might be slowing down, I think, in recent years, but that had been a frustration that I felt like what I built last week is now out of date and not the way to do it again. And I felt like within that ecosystem, there was less emphasis on stability and maintainability, which I do think you get more so in the Python world and certainly in older languages and languages like Java. But there's a lot of bleeding edge thought and development that goes into an ecosystem like that too, which is good. So, I mean, to each their own.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Tell us in the comments what's your favorite language.
Ooh, good way to integrate the two media here. Why don't we pluck off a couple of questions to conclude with here? And our apologies if we haven't gotten to quite as many questions as we'd hoped. And my apologies if I keep hitting my hidden microphone here and you hear a tap on the screen. But how about one question each? Sure. All right, so let me find a good question for Yuliia here. Any tips to keep up with the lectures after week 4 on memory? It gets a bit hard for beginners.
Ooh, well, I think like week 4 and week 5 is really a top of the hill. So if you got there, like you're pretty much there. Week 4 is memory and week 5 is data structures, which definitely gets a little bit like dense in terms of like concepts and even how like intellectually maybe difficult it is to get. But really after week 5, we're sort of like plateauing and slowing down a little bit and doing more like fun things. So week 6 is Python, week 7 is SQL, which is my favorite week, especially the 50 wheel P set. And then you get to delve into web programming, and I think it really just becomes like more hands-on and like fun to play around with. So if you are at week 4, week 5, like I would just say like stick with it a little bit more, because that's when sort of like after that the fun stuff begins in a sense.
Yeah.
Not to say that C is not fun, to each of their own, but if you really find yourself struggling with like the tail end of C, just know that better times are coming.
Okay, well, we don't have to end quite on that note, but I do agree. And like in some lectures, some years, I've had this picture of like someone climbing a hill and you're almost there at the pinnacle because it's not like all downhill from there,
right?
But it does like level off very much. And in fact, I almost feel like there's, to my comment earlier, there's sort of more meat on the bone even within our own course in that first half or that first 2/3, whereas the end of the semester is very like modern in the sense of teaching web paradigms and like, but it's more practical than I think it is intellectually stimulating, and that's why hopefully by week 6 onward, you already have that vocabulary and mental model for a lot of the concepts that we want to just have to take for granted thereafter. In fact, one of my favorite things about CS50 every year, and we see it even more personally at the undergraduate level because we see everyone more frequently in person, is like, you can change how you converse with the students after some inflection point, and it is
they know what
roughly
you're
around
talking about.
6 or 7 weeks. It's like they have now grown up. Like a couple months in only, you can start using bigger words, so to speak. You can use more technical jargon, and it's sort of delightful because now they're on that same like plane as you technologically, and that's just not the case 6-7 weeks prior when we're introducing Scratch and zeros and ones from the get-go.
Yeah, definitely.
How about as maybe a final question to this last one on the screen?
Yeah. So, will you ever do lectures outside of the U.S.? And someone said that they really like CS50 lectures.
Oh, well, nice. Well, okay, I wasn't fishing for that last part, but what a timely question. So, yes, in a few weeks' time, we'll be holding another CS50 hackathon, this time in London, England. We'll be circulating information via CS50's social media channels in the days to come if you are near enough to London to partake in that. Space will be limited because we'll be doing it with our friends at Meta down the road in their offices, and there's only so much physical space, but it'll be an opportunity not just to work on some coding project of interest or a problem set or a final project, but to hear from me and some of CS50's other team members and to learn a little something more in person and also get to experience what so many of the students here are able to experience in person as well.
Awesome.
All right. Well, any final words for our studio audience?
I think it's a very cute way to end my time at CS50 because on my first day at CS50, I almost crashed David's live stream when they were doing a video because I did not realize it was a live stream and they were actually filming something. So I very naively started walking into the camera and then Carter politely pushed me off to the side. So I think it's funny that we're ending on a note when we're filming now this together.
Yes, yes, indeed. Suffice it to say, Yuliia is moving on like so many of our preceptors past. We have a wonderful new team member joining us soon whom you'll meet before long, but we will especially miss you as you move on to bigger and better things.
Yeah, and I'll miss the team and the community and everything that CS50 is.
Well, then I'll let you say the final word. This was
CS50.